I became obsessed with learning Morse code from old war movies. It ended up saving 40 people's lives. Everyone thought I was stuck in the past. My name is Adrian, and for the last 9 years, I'd been completely obsessed with Morse code. Not in a casual way where you learn SOS and call it done, but in an all-consuming manner where I could tap out entire conversations at 30 words per minute and recognize patterns in my sleep. It started when I was 24, watching Das Boot for the third time in my tiny apartment in Seattle. There was something about those tense submarine scenes where the radio operator would tap out messages in the darkness, the crew's lives depending on those precise rhythms. I paused the movie and looked up the basics online, thinking I'd learn a few letters for fun. 9 years later, I had notebooks filled with practice transcriptions, audio recordings of myself tapping various messages, and a collection of vintage telegraph keys I'd bought from estate sales and antique shops. My girlfriend Laura left me over it 3 years ago, saying I cared more about dead communication methods than our actual relationship. She wasn't completely wrong. My parents stopped asking about my hobby after the first year, their disappointment obvious whenever they visited and saw my living room dominated by Morse code charts and old military equipment. My younger brother Kyle, who worked in tech and made 3 times my salary, would make jokes about me preparing for some apocalypse scenario where all modern technology failed. I worked as a night security guard at a maritime museum, which gave me plenty of quiet hours to practice. My co-workers thought it was harmless if weird, and my supervisor once asked if I was planning to join a historical reenactment group. I wasn't. I just found something deeply satisfying about the precision and clarity of Morse code, the way complex thoughts could be reduced to dots and dashes, the rhythm and musicality of it. I'd progressed beyond just tapping on tables to using actual telegraph keys, and I'd taught myself to recognize Morse in various forms, visual flashes, audio tones, even rhythmic knocking patterns. My apartment neighbor complained once about the tapping sounds at 2 a.m., and I had to explain I was practicing communication techniques from World War II. She looked at me like I was insane. The museum job paid barely enough to cover rent and food, but it gave me access to their archives of naval communication equipment, and I'd spend my breaks studying original telegraph logs from merchant ships and military vessels. I could read them as easily as English text, the patterns so ingrained in my mind that dots and dashes had become a second language. My social life was non-existent beyond occasional visits with Kyle and his family, and even those were strained because his wife Melissa clearly thought I was wasting my life on irrelevant skills. At family dinners, they'd talk about their kids' achievements and Kyle's promotion, while I'd sit there knowing my most recent accomplishment was successfully transcribing a 1943 naval distress call from a scratchy audio recording. My parents would ask with forced optimism if anything interesting was happening at work, and I'd talk about new exhibits at the museum while avoiding mention of spending 6 hours perfecting my continental Morse versus international Morse distinctions. Nobody understood why I cared so much about something that had been obsolete for decades. The invitation came in March from my college roommate Derek, who I hadn't seen in 5 years. He was getting married in the Bahamas and wanted his old friends there for a destination wedding. The resort was on a small private island, all-inclusive and expensive, but Derek's fiancée came from money, and they were covering most costs for guests. I almost didn't go because the ticket alone would drain my savings, but Kyle convinced me I needed to get out and socialize instead of spending another weekend with my telegraph keys. So I booked the flight and packed my bag, deliberately leaving all my Morse code materials at home, except for a small practice key I'd slipped into my luggage at the last minute, unable to fully disconnect from my obsession even on vacation. The flight down was uneventful, and I spent it reading a book about World War II codebreakers, which probably said everything about my priorities. The resort was beautiful in that generic tropical way, white sand beaches and clear water and palm trees, everything perfectly maintained for wealthy tourists who wanted paradise without any rough edges. The wedding weekend started on a Thursday with a welcome party where I reconnected with old college friends who'd all moved on to successful careers and families. Derek was now a corporate lawyer, his fiancée Vanessa worked in investment banking, and their friend group consisted of similarly accomplished people who politely asked what I did and then struggled to hide their reaction when I said, "Museum security guard." I felt like I was back in college, always the oddball who didn't quite fit the expected trajectory. That first night I met some of the other guests, including Vanessa's brother, a surgeon named Gregory, who talked extensively about his work, and a couple named Judith and Raymond who owned a chain of restaurants in Florida. Everyone was friendly enough, but I could feel the invisible barrier between their lives and mine, the unspoken assessment that I was the wedding guest who hadn't lived up to his potential. I went to bed early, listening to the ocean through my window and tapping out random messages on my nightstand, the familiar rhythm comforting in this environment where I felt so out of place. Friday was the bachelor and bachelorette parties, separate events that lasted most of the day. The bachelor party involved deep sea fishing on a chartered boat, and I ended up talking with an older guest named Walter, who'd served in the Navy in the 1970s. When he found out about my Morse code hobby, his whole demeanor changed, and we spent 2 hours discussing radio communication protocols while everyone else drank and fished. Walter told me about his time as a radio man on a destroyer the stress of copying messages in rough seas, the precision required when lives depended on accurate communication. It was the first genuine conversation I'd had all weekend, connecting with someone who understood why these skills mattered, even if they were outdated. He showed me a tattoo on his forearm, a simple series of dots and dashes that spelled out his ship's call sign, and said some things, "Stay with you forever." That evening at the rehearsal dinner, I felt slightly less out of place, having found at least one person who didn't think my obsession was completely pointless. The dinner was elaborate, multiple courses and expensive wine, speeches from family members about Derek and Vanessa's love story. Saturday was the wedding day, ceremony at sunset on the beach, followed by a reception in the resort's grand ballroom. The ceremony was beautiful, Vanessa in a stunning dress, Derek crying during his vows, the whole scene perfectly orchestrated and photographed from every angle. I stood in the back with the other miscellaneous guests, watching my old friends start this new chapter while I remained stuck in the same patterns I'd been cycling through for years. The reception was loud and crowded, a DJ playing top 40 hits while people danced and drank, and I found myself standing at the edge of the room, nursing a beer and watching everyone else have fun. Walter found me, and we talked more about naval history, both of us clearly more comfortable discussing technical details than participating in the party atmosphere. Around 10 p.m., Vanessa's parents announced they'd arranged a special surprise for Sunday, a chartered yacht excursion for all the wedding guests to a nearby uninhabited island for a beach party and snorkeling. Everyone cheered, and the party continued until well past midnight, but I slipped away earlier, exhausted from 2 days of forced socializing. Sunday morning arrived with clear skies and calm seas. The yacht was impressive, a 120-foot vessel with multiple decks, a full crew, and capacity for about 80 passengers. All 40 wedding guests boarded along with the crew of 8, everyone excited for this final adventure before flying home Monday. I brought a book and planned to find a quiet spot to read while everyone else snorkeled and partied. The yacht departed at 10 a.m., and the captain announced the uninhabited island was about 2 hours away, plenty of time to enjoy the open water and the bar service the crew was providing. People spread out across the decks, some sunbathing, others drinking and socializing, couples taking photos against the ocean backdrop. I found a seat on the upper deck away from the main party and opened my book, but the sun and sea air made me drowsy. Walter sat down next to me after about 30 minutes, and we continued our conversation from the previous night, discussing the differences between naval communication protocols across different eras. He mentioned that modern ships still had emergency Morse capability built into their systems, even though almost nobody knew how to use it anymore, a backup for scenarios where more sophisticated communication failed. An hour into the journey, I noticed the captain and first mate having an intense conversation near the bridge, their body language suggesting something was wrong. The yacht's speed had decreased noticeably, and I could hear the engines making an unusual sound, a grinding noise that didn't seem normal. Walter noticed too, his Navy experience making him attuned to mechanical problems on vessels. Other guests were too busy drinking and socializing to pay attention, music playing from speakers mounted around the deck. The captain made an announcement asking everyone to remain calm, but informing us they were experiencing engine trouble and were working to resolve it. The party atmosphere dimmed slightly, people exchanging concerned looks, but nobody seemed particularly worried. The crew was professional and reassuring, bringing out more food and drinks while the captain and engineer disappeared into the engine room. Walter and I moved closer to the bridge where we could hear more of what was happening. The engineer emerged looking stressed, telling the captain that both main engines had overheated and shut down, something about a coolant system failure he was trying to fix. The yacht was now drifting, backup generators running to maintain electrical power. The captain tried the radio to contact the resort and report their situation, but nothing happened when he pressed the transmit button. He tried multiple frequencies, checked connections, his frustration visible as the radio remained completely dead. The first mate examined the equipment and discovered water damage in the radio compartment, apparently from a leak nobody had noticed until now, the salt water having corroded critical components. The captain's face went pale as he realized they had no way to communicate their position or situation to anyone on shore. They had life jackets and emergency supplies, but without engines or radio, they were drifting in the Caribbean with 48 people on board and no way to call for help. The crew tried not to alarm the guests, but word spread quickly that they were stranded. Some people stayed calm, others started panicking. The festive atmosphere completely evaporated. Derek tried to keep everyone positive, suggesting this was just a minor delay and rescue would come soon, but I could see the fear in his eyes. Vanessa was crying, her perfect wedding weekend turning into a nightmare. I found Walter and asked if there were any other communication methods on board. He said most yachts this size had emergency position indicating radio beacons, but the captain had already confirmed theirs wasn't functioning either, likely damaged in the same leak that killed the radio. Cell phones had no signal this far from shore, and the yacht's satellite phone required a subscription service that apparently had lapsed months ago. Classic case of cutting corners on safety equipment. The sun was directly overhead now, temperature climbing into the 90s, and the yacht was drifting further from any shipping lanes where someone might spot them. The captain gathered everyone on the main deck and explained the situation honestly, They were working on the engines but needed parts they didn't have. The radio was destroyed. They had food and water for maybe 3 days, and their best hope was that the resort would notice they hadn't returned and send search parties. But the ocean was vast, and without knowing their exact drift pattern, searchers could take days or weeks to locate them. Some guests started arguing with the captain, demanding he fix the situation, while others sat in stunned silence processing the reality that they might die out here. I went back to my cabin and retrieved my practice telegraph key from my luggage, an idea forming that seemed insane but might be their only option. The yacht had electrical power from backup generators, and if I could find a way to connect a signal light to a power source and use Morse code to send distress signals, there was a chance someone might see it. I brought the telegraph key to the bridge and tried to explain my idea to the captain, but he was overwhelmed dealing with panicked guests and skeptical that my hobby could help. I insisted we had to try something, that Morse code was still an internationally recognized distress signal, and if we could rig a bright enough light, passing ships or aircraft might spot it. Walter backed me up, explaining his Navy background and confirming that Morse distress signals were still monitored by maritime authorities. The captain finally agreed to let me try, assigning one of the crew members, a young deckhand named Paolo, to help me find supplies. We searched the yacht and found a powerful spotlight used for night navigation, along with electrical cable and tools to modify the connection. The technical challenge was connecting my telegraph key to control the spotlight's power, creating a circuit where pressing the key would flash the light in Morse patterns. Paolo had some electrical knowledge and helped me wire everything together, both of us working quickly while the afternoon sun beat down. Other guests watched with varying degrees of hope and skepticism, some asking what I was doing, others dismissing it as pointless. Derek came over and asked if I seriously thought this would work, and I told him honestly I had no idea, but doing something was better than waiting helplessly. We mounted the spotlight on the highest point of the yacht with a clear view in all directions, and I tested the connection by tapping out a simple message. The light flashed in response to my key presses, bright enough to be visible even in daylight. Walter suggested I focus on the international distress signal SOS, the most recognizable Morse pattern: 3 short flashes, 3 long flashes, 3 short flashes. I began transmitting, falling into the rhythm I'd practiced thousands of times in my apartment, my muscle memory taking over. ... Pause, repeat, over and over. The first hour passed with no response. Just me tapping out SOS while everyone else waited and watched the horizon. Some guests returned to the shade, unable to watch anymore, their hope fading. The heat was brutal, and I was sweating heavily, but I kept transmitting, my fingers cramping from the repetitive motion. Walter brought me water and encouraged me to keep going, saying the signal could be visible for miles if anyone was looking. The crew continued working on the engines without success, and the captain was plotting their drift pattern, trying to calculate where they might end up. As the afternoon wore on, the situation became more real to everyone. This wasn't just an inconvenience or a delay, they were genuinely stranded without communication. And if rescue didn't come soon, things would get dangerous. Food and water were limited. The sun exposure was causing people to burn and dehydrate, and the psychological stress of being helpless in the open ocean was breaking down the group's composure. Arguments broke out over rationing supplies, some people blaming the captain for the equipment failures, others praying or crying. I transmitted continuously as the sun moved lower in the sky, my hand aching but not stopping. ... The pattern was burned into my nervous system, as automatic as breathing. Around 5 p.m., Paolo shouted and pointed at the horizon where a small aircraft was visible in the distance. I increased my transmission speed, making the flashes more urgent and obvious, hoping the pilot would notice. The plane was heading roughly in our direction but still several miles away, too far to guarantee they'd see us against the vast ocean. Everyone on the yacht was now watching and shouting, waving their arms even though the plane was too distant for that to matter. I kept signaling, my entire focus on that telegraph key and the rhythm of SOS. The aircraft came closer, a small twin-engine plane that appeared to be a private charter or tourist flight. When it was about 2 miles away, I saw it bank slightly, changing course toward us. Someone had seen the signal. The plane circled overhead and I switched from SOS to a new message, tapping out "Stranded Need Rescue" over and over, praying whoever was up there knew Morse code. The aircraft circled twice more, low enough that we could see the pilot waving, confirming he understood. Then it climbed and headed back toward the islands, presumably to report our location and coordinate rescue. The relief was overwhelming, people crying and hugging, thanking me with genuine emotion. But we weren't saved yet. We still needed actual rescue boats to reach us, which could take hours. I continued transmitting in case other vessels were in the area, not wanting to risk losing contact with potential rescuers. The sun set around 6:30, and in the darkness, the spotlight's flashes became even more visible, cutting through the night like a beacon. Walter stayed with me the entire time, bringing food and water, encouraging me when my hand cramped so badly I could barely press the key. Around 8 p.m., we saw lights on the horizon, multiple vessels approaching from the direction of the islands. The Bahamian Coast Guard had dispatched rescue boats after the pilot's report, and they'd used our Morse signal to navigate directly to our position. 3 Coast Guard vessels arrived within 20 minutes, their crews professional and efficient, immediately assessing the situation and beginning to evacuate guests. The captain explained what had happened, the engine failure and radio damage, and how one of the guests had rigged a Morse code signal that the passing aircraft had spotted. The Coast Guard commander, a weathered man named Lieutenant Kemp, came to the bridge and asked who'd been sending the Morse. I identified myself, and he shook my hand firmly, saying my signal had been perfect, textbook distress protocol that had made our location and situation clear. He asked where I'd learned Morse code and seemed surprised when I said old war movies and personal obsession. Lieutenant Kemp said most recreational boaters didn't know Morse anymore, that it was a dying skill even in professional maritime contexts, but it remained one of the most reliable emergency communication methods because it required minimal technology and could be transmitted through any medium that could be seen or heard. He said I'd probably saved lives tonight because another few hours and the situation could have deteriorated significantly. The Coast Guard transported everyone back to the main island in groups, the process taking until nearly midnight. I was in the last group with Derek and Vanessa, both of them still processing what had happened. Back at the resort, we were checked by medical staff for dehydration and sun exposure. Most people were fine, just shaken and exhausted. The resort management was apologetic and offered extended stays and refunds, trying to manage the liability situation. The story spread quickly among the other resort guests, and by Monday morning, everyone knew about the wedding party that had been stranded and rescued thanks to someone's obscure Morse code hobby. Local news picked up the story, interviewing Lieutenant Kemp, who praised the unconventional but effective distress signal. A reporter found me and asked for an interview, and I explained the whole background, my 9-year obsession with learning Morse code from World War II movies, how everyone had thought it was pointless, how it had ended up being the only thing that could save us when modern technology failed. The story went viral within days, picked up by national news outlets who loved the human interest angle. My phone filled with messages from people I hadn't heard from in years, including my ex-girlfriend Laura, who said she was glad I was safe, and maybe she'd been too harsh about the Morse code thing. My parents called crying, relieved I was alive and suddenly proud of the hobby they'd dismissed for years. The most unexpected call came from a naval historian who'd seen the news coverage and wanted to interview me about my Morse code knowledge for a documentary he was producing. He said skilled Morse operators were increasingly rare, and preserving that knowledge was important for historical records. I flew back to Seattle the following week, still processing everything that had happened. The museum where I worked threw a small celebration, my supervisor joking that maybe my obsession with old communication technology wasn't so crazy after all. My co-workers asked me to demonstrate Morse code and were genuinely impressed when I tapped out complex messages at speed. Kyle called and apologized for all the times he'd mocked my hobby, admitting he'd been wrong to dismiss something I was passionate about just because it seemed impractical. His wife Melissa even sent a message saying their kids wanted to learn Morse code, thinking it was cool that their uncle had used it to save people. The validation felt good, but it also felt strange because I hadn't learned Morse code to be a hero or to prove anyone wrong. I'd learned it because something about those patterns and rhythms spoke to me in a way I couldn't fully articulate. Several of the wedding guests reached out personally to thank me, including Gregory the surgeon, who admitted he'd judged me harshly when we first met, assuming my security guard job meant I lacked ambition or intelligence. He said the experience taught him that value and capability come in unexpected forms, that the skills society elevates aren't always the ones that matter in crisis situations. Judith and Raymond, the restaurant owners, sent a generous gift card with a note saying they'd never dismiss someone's passion again, no matter how unusual it seemed. Walter and I stayed in touch, emailing regularly about maritime history and communication technology, forming a genuine friendship based on shared interests. He sent me several books from his personal collection, including a rare manual on naval radio procedures from the 1960s that I treasured. Derek and Vanessa sent a card with a heartfelt message saying their marriage literally owed its beginning to my Morse code skills, that without the rescue, their wedding weekend would have ended in tragedy. They asked if I'd come visit them in Chicago sometime, and I promised I would, feeling like maybe I'd misjudged how much our college friendship still meant. The viral news coverage had unexpected professional consequences. I received several job offers from maritime museums and historical societies who wanted someone with genuine expertise in old communication technology, not just theoretical knowledge but practical skills. One offer came from a naval museum in San Diego that was developing an interactive exhibit on World War II communication systems and needed a technical consultant who could actually operate the equipment. The salary was double what I made in Seattle, with benefits and opportunities for advancement. I accepted and moved to California that summer, starting a job where my obsession was actually valued and utilized. My new colleagues were academics and historians who appreciated deep knowledge in specialized areas, who understood that expertise often required years of focused practice that others might consider excessive. I gave demonstrations of Morse code transmission to school groups visiting the museum, seeing kids' eyes light up when they learned they could communicate through simple patterns of light or sound. Some of them asked how to learn it themselves, and I started teaching a weekend class, passing on skills that might otherwise disappear completely. The documentary about naval communications featured a segment on my story, interviewing me about the rescue and my background with Morse code. The director asked if I thought my obsession had been worth it, whether 9 years of practice for one critical moment was a reasonable trade-off. I said I'd never practiced thinking it would save lives, that the value had always been intrinsic, the satisfaction of mastering something difficult and connecting with history through practical skill rather than just reading about it. The fact that it ended up being useful in an emergency was almost beside the point, though obviously I was grateful it had worked out that way. The director said my answer was interesting because it suggested true passion doesn't require external validation, that the doing itself was the reward. I'd never thought about it that way, but maybe he was right. Maybe the years I'd spent alone in my apartment tapping out messages nobody would hear had been worthwhile simply because they'd brought me satisfaction and purpose, and the rescue was just an unexpected bonus that happened to vindicate the journey. My relationship with my family improved significantly after everything. My parents visited the new museum and watched me give demonstrations, finally understanding that my knowledge was genuine expertise rather than useless trivia. They apologized for dismissing my interests, and I told them I understood why they'd been concerned, that from the outside, it had looked like I was wasting time on irrelevant skills instead of building a normal career. But maybe normal careers weren't the only path. Maybe there was value in pursuing what genuinely fascinated you, even if others couldn't see the point. Kyle brought his family to visit, and his kids were enthralled by the museum exhibits, asking endless questions about how radio operators could communicate across oceans using only dots and dashes. I taught them basic Morse code, and they practiced on the drive home, tapping messages to each other, probably driving Kyle and Melissa crazy. But I hoped maybe one of them would maintain the interest, that the skill would survive another generation because someone had found it compelling and worth preserving. That's how knowledge persists, through passion rather than practical necessity. The experience changed how I thought about useful versus useless skills, about what society values and why. We'd been on that yacht with doctors and lawyers and business owners, people with impressive credentials and practical abilities, but when the technology failed and we needed someone who could communicate through a manual light signal, my weird hobby had been the only thing that worked. It wasn't that those other skills didn't matter. Obviously, society needs surgeons and attorneys, but maybe there's more room than we think for seemingly impractical knowledge, for people who preserve old techniques and obscure capabilities just because they find them interesting. The world is unpredictable, and we can't always know which skills will prove critical in unexpected situations. I'd spent 9 years learning Morse code, never imagining it would save 40 people's lives, but that's exactly what happened, and now I had a responsibility to make sure the knowledge didn't die with my generation. I started writing articles about Morse code for maritime journals, technical pieces about transmission techniques, and historical pieces about its role in naval warfare. Some academic journals accepted my submissions, giving me credentials I'd never sought but which helped establish legitimacy in this niche field. The anniversary of the rescue came, and Derek organized a reunion for everyone who'd been on the yacht. We met at a restaurant in Miami, all 40 wedding guests, plus some of the Coast Guard crew who'd performed the rescue. Lieutenant Kemp attended and gave a short speech about maritime safety and the importance of backup communication systems. He specifically mentioned that the incident had prompted the Bahamian Maritime Authority to update their regulations requiring all charter vessels to maintain multiple independent communication capabilities, including manual signaling equipment and crew training in emergency protocols. He said one good outcome of our near disaster was improved safety standards that would protect future passengers. We toasted to survival and second chances, sharing stories about what we'd been doing in the year since the rescue. Several people said the experience had changed their perspective on life, made them reassess priorities and take risks they'd been avoiding. Gregory the surgeon had started a free clinic in his spare time, saying the yacht experience reminded him that privilege came with responsibility. Judith and Raymond had sold their restaurant chain and were traveling the world, deciding life was too short to spend every day managing businesses they no longer enjoyed. Derek and Vanessa announced they were expecting a baby, and Vanessa joked that if it was a boy, they might name him Adrian. Everyone laughed, and I felt genuinely touched, though I told her to please pick a normal name and just teach the kid Morse code instead. Walter brought his wife and introduced me, explaining how we'd bonded over naval history during the wedding weekend. She thanked me for keeping everyone calm during the crisis, saying Walter had told her I'd transmitted for over 8 hours straight without stopping, even when my hand was cramping and bleeding from the repetitive motion. I hadn't realized I'd been bleeding. The adrenaline had kept me from noticing until afterward. The reunion felt like closure, a chance to celebrate survival with people who understood what we'd been through together. We exchanged contact information and promised to stay in touch, though I knew most of these connections would fade over time. That was okay. Some friendships are circumstantial, bonded through shared crisis rather than ongoing compatibility. But a few relationships would persist, particularly with Walter, who remained a genuine friend and mentor. 2 years after the rescue, I was promoted to senior curator at the Naval Museum, overseeing their entire communications exhibit and developing new educational programs. My salary had increased to the point where I could afford a real apartment instead of the studio I'd lived in for years, and I'd started dating someone I'd met at a museum conference, another historian who specialized in World War II cryptography. Her name was Elaine, and she understood my obsession with Morse code because she had similar intensity about her own research interests. We'd spend evenings together working on our respective projects, comfortable in parallel focus, occasionally sharing interesting findings. It was the healthiest relationship I'd ever had, built on mutual respect for each other's passions, rather than trying to change each other. When I told her about the yacht rescue, she wasn't surprised, saying people who dedicate themselves to mastering obscure skills often end up being exactly what's needed in unexpected situations. She said history was full of examples of dismissed expertise suddenly becoming critical, and maybe that's why it was important to support people's genuine interests, even when they seemed impractical. The museum hosted a special event on the 3rd anniversary of the rescue, a presentation about emergency communication methods that featured my story as a central example. We invited Lieutenant Kemp and some of the Coast Guard crew, along with representatives from maritime safety organizations. I gave a live demonstration of Morse code transmission using period equipment. Then we discussed modern applications and the ongoing relevance of manual communication skills. A reporter asked if I thought more people should learn Morse code, and I said honestly probably not, that it wasn't practical for most people's daily lives. But I did think there was value in people pursuing whatever genuinely fascinated them, developing deep expertise in areas they cared about, even if those areas seemed useless to others, because we couldn't predict which skills would matter, and diversity of knowledge across a population meant someone would probably have the right capability when an unusual situation arose. The reporter followed up asking if I had any regrets about spending 9 years on something most people dismissed, and I said no. Those years had brought me satisfaction and purpose, had connected me with history and with people like Walter who shared my interests. The rescue had validated the skill publicly, but the skill itself had been valuable all along, just not in ways others could easily recognize. My story became a case study in emergency management courses, used as an example of creative problem-solving and the importance of diverse skill sets in crisis situations. I was invited to speak at several conferences about maritime safety and disaster preparedness, talking about how the yacht rescue had succeeded because someone happened to have unusual knowledge that matched an unusual problem. I emphasized that nobody could have predicted Morse code would be useful in that specific scenario, that I certainly hadn't learned it thinking it would ever save lives. But the unpredictability was exactly why it was valuable to have people with varied expertise, why society shouldn't be too quick to dismiss interests that seemed impractical or outdated. Every talk ended with questions about how to learn Morse code, and I'd provide resources while also encouraging people to find their own obsessions, whatever genuinely captivated them regardless of apparent utility. Some people followed up months later saying they'd learned Morse or picked up other unusual skills, and they'd found the process rewarding even without any practical application. Now, 5 years after the rescue, I'm 33 and working on a book about the history of maritime communication, with a chapter dedicated to the yacht incident and what it taught about resilience and resourcefulness. The book contract came from a publisher who'd read about the rescue and thought the broader story of how humans have communicated across distances deserved popular treatment. I'm halfway through the manuscript, balancing writing with my museum work and my relationship with Elaine, who's now my fiancée. We're planning a small wedding, nothing like Derek and Vanessa's elaborate destination affair, just close friends and family at a venue in San Diego. I've asked Walter to be one of my groomsmen, and he's accepted, joking that at least our wedding won't end with anyone stranded at sea. My parents are proud in a way they never were before the rescue, frequently telling people about their son who saved 40 lives with Morse code. I try to redirect the narrative when I can, emphasizing that I'd loved Morse code long before it proved useful, that the value wasn't in the rescue, but in the journey of learning. But I understand they need to frame it in terms of practical outcomes, that most people think in terms of utility rather than intrinsic satisfaction. The yacht incident gave me a platform I'd never sought, a story that resonates with people because it challenges assumptions about what skills matter and why. I use that platform to advocate for curiosity-driven learning, for pursuing knowledge without demanding immediate practical application, for trusting that expertise develops through genuine interest rather than career strategy. The world needs specialists in obscure fields, needs people who preserve old techniques and maintain capabilities that aren't currently fashionable, but might prove critical in unpredictable ways. My Morse code obsession saved lives not because I planned it that way, but because I'd spent 9 years developing expertise for its own sake, and circumstances happened to require exactly that skill set. You can't engineer those outcomes, can only pursue what fascinates you and trust that passion has value independent of external validation. That's what I tell the students who take my Morse code classes, the museum visitors who ask how I stayed motivated through years of practice, the conference attendees who want to know if it was worth it. The answer is always yes, it was worth it, because the doing itself brought meaning long before the rescue gave it purpose others could recognize. Thanks for hanging out till the end. If you want more stories, make sure to subscribe and leave your take below.